The bedrock of Manhattan lies deeper than most imagine. Ancient schist and granite formed 500 million years ago, compressed by forces that existed before life moved onto land. In 1966, drilling rigs punched through 70 feet of landfill, sediment, and human construction to reach that stone, preparing foundations for something that had never been attempted at such scale. The sound of the drills echoed across Lower Manhattan, a neighborhood that had been rebuilt and demolished and rebuilt again so many times that its streets existed in layers, each era buried beneath the next. Few people walking past the construction site understood what was being prepared, what ambition was about to manifest in steel and concrete, what family's final architectural statement was taking shape in the hole being carved from the southern tip of the island. The Rockefellers had shaped American industry for 3 generations, had built an oil empire that controlled 90% of the nation's refining capacity before federal courts forced its dissolution, had constructed Rockefeller Center when the Depression had paralyzed every other major development, had financed universities and hospitals and museums, and now, in what would become their last monument, they were preparing to build higher than anyone had built before. David Rockefeller stood at the window of his office in the Chase Manhattan Bank Tower, watching the excavation proceed. He was 51 years old in 1966, the youngest of John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s 6 children, educated at Harvard and the London School of Economics, trained in the mechanisms of international finance, and positioned at the intersection of American banking and political power in ways that made formal titles almost irrelevant. His title was chairman of Chase Manhattan, but his influence extended through networks of boards and committees and informal relationships that connected finance to government to academia, to philanthropy in patterns that were difficult to trace but easy to feel. The World Trade Center was not officially his project. It belonged to the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, a quasi-governmental entity that operated outside normal democratic oversight, funded by revenue bonds rather than taxes, accountable to appointed commissioners rather than elected officials. But David Rockefeller had advocated for the project, had used his influence to ensure its location would be in Lower Manhattan near Chase's headquarters rather than on the East Side where it was originally planned, had mobilized the political support necessary to overcome the objections of people who would be displaced and businesses that would be destroyed. His brother Nelson was governor of New York, positioned to approve or block any project of this scale, and the alignment of family interests with state power created conditions where what the Rockefellers wanted generally happened, regardless of what processes were formally required. The site being excavated was not empty land waiting for development. It was a neighborhood called Radio Row, 13 blocks of small businesses that had grown organically since the 1920s. Shops selling electronics and components and surplus military equipment, establishments run by immigrants and their children, Syrian Jews and Greeks, and Italians who had found niches in the complex ecology of New York commerce. 30,000 people worked in Radio Row, not in corporate offices, but in the kind of small-scale entrepreneurship that requires no credentials, only knowledge of products and customers and the patience to build a business over years. The shops were crowded and chaotic, inventory stacked on shelves that reached the ceiling, owners who knew the location of every component without needing computerized systems, customers who came because Radio Row had things that couldn't be found elsewhere. It was the opposite of the clean corporate aesthetic that the Rockefellers preferred, the opposite of the rationalized systems that modern management theory prescribed, the opposite of everything the World Trade Center would represent. And it was in the way. The Port Authority had the legal power to condemn the property, to force sales to eminent domain, to compensate owners at rates the authority determined were fair, regardless of what the owners believed their businesses were worth. The process was called urban renewal, a term that suggested improvement and progress and the correction of blight. The Radio Row was not blighted by any objective measure. The stores were profitable, the streets were busy, the neighborhood functioned as thousands of New York neighborhoods had functioned for generations, through dense networks of relationships and accumulated knowledge that existed nowhere except in the minds of the people who worked there. But Radio Row occupied land that could be put to what planners considered higher use, could generate more tax revenue, could attract the kind of corporate tenants that symbolized modern economic power. The small business owners organized, hired lawyers, filed lawsuits claiming the takings were not for genuine public use but for private benefit, that the Port Authority was acting as a developer rather than as a transportation agency, that the destruction of a functioning neighborhood could not be justified by vague claims about economic development. The courts rejected these arguments. The definition of public use had been expanding for decades, stretched by judges who deferred to legislative and administrative determinations about what served the public interest. If a government authority claimed a project served the public, courts were increasingly reluctant to second-guess that claim, even when the primary beneficiaries were private corporations and the people displaced were small business owners with no comparable alternatives. By 1967, the demolition had begun. Buildings that had stood for 50 years came down in weeks, reduced to rubble by crews working with the efficiency that comes from doing the same thing repeatedly. The business owners watched their life's work disappear, shops they had built and operated for decades suddenly gone, customer bases scattered, supplier relationships severed, the accumulated knowledge of where to find specialized components and how to price them competitively and which customers needed what suddenly irrelevant. Some received compensation that allowed them to relocate, though the new locations were rarely as advantageous and the rents were higher and the customers often didn't follow. Others closed permanently, unable to afford relocation or unable to recreate the specific conditions that had made their businesses viable. The Port Authority's economic analyses had not seriously considered this cost, had treated the businesses as generic units that could be moved without loss of function, had assumed that employment was fungible and that workers displaced from Radio Row would find equivalent work elsewhere. This assumption ignored everything specific about how labor markets actually operated, how particular skills matched with particular opportunities, how social networks and geographic proximity created access to jobs that seemed open in the abstract but were closed to people who lacked the right connections or lived in the wrong neighborhoods. The excavation reached bedrock and continued, carving a foundation that would extend 70 feet below street level, deeper than the subways that already tunneled through the area, deeper than the utility lines and steam pipes and the forgotten wooden pilings that supported older buildings constructed when the shoreline was further east. The material removed from the excavation was more than 1 million cubic yards of earth and rock and debris, and it had to go somewhere. The engineers designed a solution that served multiple purposes, using the excavated material to create new land extending into the Hudson River, 23 acres of landfill that would eventually become Battery Park City, a residential and commercial development that would add another layer of real estate value to the overall project. The environmental consequences of this landfill were not seriously studied. The river's edge was treated as a boundary to be redrawn rather than as an ecological system with its own dynamics, and the long-term effects of adding 23 acres of new land would unfold over decades in ways that were difficult to attribute to any single decision. The structural design of the towers was the work of Leslie Robertson and his engineering team, working from architectural concepts developed by Minoru Yamasaki. The challenge was to build taller than any structure previously constructed while creating large column-free floor plates that could be subdivided flexibly for different tenants. The solution was a tube design, with most of the structural support provided by closely spaced columns in the exterior walls, rather than by a traditional internal skeleton. This approach created floors that were essentially hollow boxes, with the perimeter providing most of the strength and the core containing elevators and mechanical systems but not major structural elements. The design was innovative and efficient and allowed the towers to rise to heights that conventional structural systems could not have achieved with the same economy of materials. It also created a structure that was fundamentally different from traditional skyscraper design, with characteristics that would not be fully tested until the buildings faced stresses their designers had not adequately imagined. The steel for the towers was fabricated across the United States, in mills that had been built to serve the demands of the Second World War and that were now looking for peacetime orders large enough to keep the facilities operating. The columns and beams arrived at the site already cut and drilled to specifications, pieces of a puzzle that existed first as engineering drawings, and then as physical objects that had to be assembled in the correct sequence at the correct elevations. The iron workers who performed this assembly were members of unions that had negotiated contracts guaranteeing wages and safety standards that represented decades of organizing and strikes. The work was dangerous, performed at heights that increased as the towers rose, connecting steel members while standing on beams a few inches wide, with nothing but harnesses preventing falls that would be fatal. Several workers died during construction, falling or crushed by equipment, or killed in accidents that were investigated and documented and then forgotten, treated as the inevitable cost of building at this scale. Acceptable losses in projects where the deadline and budget mattered more than the individual workers whose labor made the construction possible. Austin Tobin led the Port Authority through the entire planning and construction process, chairman of the agency from 1942 until 1972, a lawyer who had transformed the authority from a modest transportation coordinator into a powerful development agency with resources that exceeded those of many state governments. Tobin understood that the authority's financial model required continuous expansion, that the revenue bond structure demanded new projects that could generate income to service debt that had to be constantly refinanced and increased. The World Trade Center was the culmination of this model, a project so large that it would dominate the authority's finances for decades. Successful only if the optimistic projections about rental income materialized, catastrophic if the market for office space turned out to be weaker than predicted. Tobin was confident, or at least projected confidence, asserting that corporations would compete to lease space in the tallest buildings in the world, that the prestige value alone would justify rents high enough to service the bonds. His confidence was based partly on analysis and partly on belief, on the assumption that what had worked before would continue working, that the post-war expansion of corporate capitalism would continue indefinitely, that New York's position as the center of global finance was secure and permanent. The towers opened in phases between 1970 and 1973, with the Port Authority itself moving into the North Tower as the anchor tenant. The authority's decision to occupy significant space in the buildings was partly functional and partly strategic, partly because the agency needed offices and partly because having the developer as a tenant sent a message about confidence in the project, but confidence could not create demand where it did not exist. The early 1970s were difficult years for New York, with the city's finances deteriorating as middle-class residents moved to suburbs and corporations, relocated to lower-cost regions, taking tax revenue and employment with them. The office market in Manhattan was oversupplied, with vacancy rates rising as new construction came online faster than tenant demand grew. The World Trade Center added 10 million square feet to this oversupply, and the Port Authority struggled to find tenants willing to pay rents that would cover the debt service on the bonds that had financed construction. Rents had to be reduced below initial projections, and even at reduced rates, many floors remained vacant for years, occupied eventually by government agencies that paid below market rates or by tenants who received concessions that further reduced the effective income. The financial model had always been precarious, based on assumptions that proved optimistic and on cross-subsidization from the Port Authority's other facilities. The bridges and tunnels the authority operated generated reliable revenue from tolls, and this revenue could be used to cover shortfalls from the trade center, effectively transferring wealth from the working and middle-class commuters, who paid tolls to the corporations and government agencies that occupied office space at subsidized rates. This transfer was legal, authorized by the Port Authority's charter and by the bond covenanters that gave the authority discretion in allocating revenue among its facilities. But it represented a fundamental distortion of the public purpose that the authority was supposed to serve, using infrastructure that served genuine transportation needs to subsidize a real estate development that primarily benefited a small number of powerful institutions. David Rockefeller watched the towers rise from his office at Chase Manhattan, satisfaction mixed with frustration at how slowly the neighborhood around them was developing. Chase had built its headquarters tower in the late 1950s, betting that financial institutions would follow and create a revitalized downtown financial district, but the bet had not paid off as hoped. The World Trade Center was supposed to accelerate this process, to establish downtown as unquestionably the center of global finance, but the slow lease-up suggested that corporations were not as committed to Manhattan as Rockefeller had assumed. The banks and financial firms that were Chase's peers were opening back-office operations in New Jersey and Connecticut, moving routine processing work to locations where real estate and labor were cheaper, keeping only the most senior executives in client-facing roles in Manhattan. This decentralization was efficient from each firm's perspective, but problematic for anyone whose wealth was tied to Manhattan real estate values. And the Rockefellers' wealth, while diversified across many assets, included significant Manhattan holdings whose value depended on the city's continued dominance. The workers who maintained the World Trade Center complex were largely invisible to the tens of thousands of people who worked in the towers. Custodial staff cleaned offices at night, arriving after the corporate employees had left, working through the early morning hours, emptying trash and vacuuming and cleaning bathrooms, paid wages that were a fraction of what the financial analysts and lawyers in the offices above earned. Security guards monitored entrances and patrolled the mall that connected the towers underground, enforcing rules about who could enter and where people could gather, maintaining order in a space that was privately controlled despite being open to the public. Maintenance workers operated the mechanical systems that kept the buildings functioning, the elevators and air conditioning and electrical distribution that allowed office work to proceed without interruption, work that required technical knowledge and that was essential, but that was treated as routine and compensated accordingly. The economic hierarchy was mapped directly onto the physical structure, with the lowest paid workers in the basement and sub-basement levels, in mechanical spaces and loading docks and cafeteria kitchens, and the highest paid workers on the upper floors, in corner offices with views that extended across the harbor and up the island, in spaces where every square foot cost more than most workers earned in a year. The observation deck on the South Tower became one of New York's most popular tourist attractions, offering views from a height that made the city below seem abstract, a pattern of streets and buildings and water that bore little relationship to the experience of walking those streets. Tourists paid admission and rode express elevators to the 107th floor, emerging onto a viewing platform where the wind was strong enough to lean into, where the height was vertiginous in ways that photographs could not capture. The view transformed the city into spectacle, something to be looked at rather than lived in, and this transformation was characteristic of how the towers functioned symbolically. They were meant to be impressive rather than welcoming, designed to announce power and scale rather than to invite interaction or participation. The plaza at the base of the towers was windswept and empty most of the time, too large and too exposed to encourage casual gathering, functioning more as a moat that separated the towers from the surrounding neighborhood than as a public space that connected them to it. The businesses that had been displaced from Radio Row were not compensated for the loss of their customer networks or their supplier relationships or the accumulated knowledge that made their operations viable. The Port Authority's appraisals had valued only the physical property, the buildings and the inventory, treating the businesses as if they were generic and could be relocated without loss of the specific conditions that made them profitable. This approach to valuation was standard in eminent domain proceedings, enshrined in legal doctrines that focused on fair market value of property rather than on the economic value of ongoing enterprises or the social costs of displacement. The small business owners who challenged these valuations in court generally lost, with judges deferring to the Port Authority's expert appraisers in treating the business owners' higher estimates as self-interested exaggeration. Some owners received settlements that allowed them to relocate, though relocation meant higher rents and new locations that lacked the foot traffic and the concentrations of complementary businesses that had made Radio Row function as an ecosystem. Others closed permanently, unable to afford relocation or unable to replicate the conditions that had made their businesses viable. Their economic knowledge and their customer relationships simply erased, treated as if they had never existed. The Port Authority was governed by commissioners appointed by the governors of New York and New Jersey, serving staggered terms that insulated them from direct political pressure and allowed them to plan with time horizons that exceeded electoral cycles. This structure had been designed to enable long-term infrastructure planning without the distortions that democratic politics supposedly created, based on the theory that technical experts could make better decisions than elected officials responding to constituent pressure. What it created in practice was an agency with enormous resources and minimal accountability. capable of making decisions that reshape the physical and economic landscape without requiring approval from voters or even from elected officials beyond the governors who appointed commissioners. The World Trade Center was the most dramatic example of what this structure enabled, a project that transformed downtown Manhattan based on the preferences of appointed commissioners and the business interests they served, implemented over the objections of the people who would be displaced, and without any meaningful process for public participation in the decision. The tower stood for 28 years before September 11, 2001. During that time, they functioned as office buildings, housing corporations, and government agencies and financial firms that conducted the daily business of global capitalism. The buildings were not beloved, not woven into the city's emotional geography the way older structures were, but they were accepted, landmarks that defined the skyline and oriented navigation, and gradually became part of how people understood the city's shape. The observation deck remained popular with tourists, and the windows on the World Restaurant on the 106th floor of the North Tower became a destination for expensive dinners and corporate events, a space where the view was as important as the food, where the height itself was part of what people were paying for. The businesses in the underground mall connecting the towers served the workers and visitors who passed through. Coffee shops and newsstands and chain stores that had none of the specific character of the businesses they had replaced, but that functioned efficiently within the corporate aesthetic the port authority preferred. The attack on September 11th began at 8:46 in the morning when American Airlines Flight 11 struck the North Tower between the 93rd and 99th floors. Traveling at roughly 450 miles per hour and carrying approximately 10,000 gallons of jet fuel, the impact was catastrophic, severing support columns and destroying the fire insulation on steel members and creating fires that burned at temperatures the building's structural system was not designed to withstand. 17 minutes later, at 9:03, United Airlines Flight 175 struck the South Tower between the 77th and 85th floors, creating similar damage and similar fires, and trapping everyone above the impact zone with no means of escape. The fires burned for 56 minutes in the South Tower and 102 minutes in the North Tower before the structures collapsed, the steel losing strength as temperatures exceeded 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The floors above the impact zones falling and creating a progressive collapse that brought both towers down at speeds that seemed to observers impossible. The entire mass of each tower compressing into rubble and dust that spread across lower Manhattan in clouds that took days to settle. The death toll was 2,753 people in the towers and on the ground, including office workers and first responders and people who happened to be passing by when the buildings collapsed. The victims included financial analysts earning six-figure salaries and food service workers earning minimum wage, included citizens and foreign nationals, included people who worked in the towers and people who were visiting, included firefighters and police officers who ran toward danger when everyone else was fleeing. The randomness of who survived and who died was absolute, determined by which floors people worked on and which stairwells they chose, and how quickly they responded to alarms and 1,000 other factors that had no relationship to merit or virtue or value. The collapse created a debris field that covered 16 acres, the remains of the towers compressed and pulverized, steel beams twisted by forces that exceeded anything the structures had been designed to resist. Concrete and drywall and glass and furniture and human remains mixed into a toxic dust that coated everything in the vicinity, and that created health problems that would unfold over years and decades. For people who breathed it or were exposed to it during the cleanup, the destruction of the towers was treated primarily as an act of terrorism, as an attack by foreign extremists against American symbols of economic and military power, and this framing was accurate but incomplete. The towers were symbols, but they were also physical structures whose design had created specific vulnerabilities, buildings whose construction had displaced communities and whose operation had required the labor of thousands of low-wage workers who were rarely acknowledged and whose deaths were mourned, collectively but not individually. The towers had represented a particular vision of urban development and economic organization, a vision that prioritized scale and efficiency and corporate power over the organic complexity of neighborhood life. And their destruction did not end this vision, but instead created opportunities to rebuild according to similar principles, using the emotional weight of the attack to override objections and accelerate processes that would have been more contentious under normal circumstances. The cleanup took months, with workers removing debris and searching for remains and trying to stabilize the structures that had survived but been damaged by the collapse. The work was dangerous, performed in conditions where air quality was poor and structures were unstable, and the psychological toll of handling human remains was severe. Many of the cleanup workers were the same low-wage workers who had maintained the towers when they stood, immigrants and people of color who performed the physical labor that others did not want to do, exposed to hazards that were not fully disclosed and that created health problems that emerged years later, long after the immediate crisis had passed and public attention had moved on. The dust from the collapse contained asbestos and lead and mercury and hundreds of other compounds that were toxic in ways that were understood but not acknowledged by authorities who wanted to reopen Lower Manhattan quickly and who prioritized economic recovery over public health. The rebuilding of the World Trade Center site became a prolonged negotiation among stakeholders whose interests aligned in some ways and conflicted in others. The Port Authority retained ownership and control, but political pressure required consultation with family members of victims, and with city and state officials, and with business interests, and with various advocacy groups that claimed standing to influence decisions about the site's future. The memorial that was eventually constructed transformed the footprints of the towers into reflecting pools, surrounded by bronze panels inscribed with the names of everyone killed in the 2001 attacks and in the 1993 bombing, creating a space for individual mourning that did not invite collective analysis of why the towers had been targets or what systems had created the conditions that made the attack possible. The design was contemplative and dignified, inviting silence and reflection rather than conversation or protest, memorializing loss without examining cause. The new tower, One World Trade Center, opened in 2014, 13 years after the attacks. The building rises 1,776 feet, a height chosen for its symbolic reference to American independence, and includes security features that were not present in the original towers. Reinforced concrete cores and enhanced structural systems and various hardened components designed to make the building more resistant to attack. These security measures added significantly to construction costs and reduced the efficiency of the floor plates, but they were considered necessary given the symbolic significance of the site and the assumption that it would remain a target. The building's design was constrained by requirements that limited height near the memorial and that required approval from multiple authorities, resulting in a structure that was more defensive and less exuberant than the original towers, a building that announced resilience rather than confidence, that suggested the need for protection rather than the assumption of invulnerability. The economic model for the rebuilding was fundamentally different from the original construction, with significant public subsidies required to make the project financially viable. Private developers were reluctant to invest in a site where security costs were prohibitive, and where the memory of the attacks created uncertainties about tenant demand, and the Port Authority in the state of New York provided financing and guarantees that reduced private risk and socialized the costs. This pattern of public investment and private benefit had characterized the original construction, but it was more explicit in the rebuilding, more obviously a transfer of resources from the broader public to specific business interests, less plausibly justified by claims about public purpose or economic necessity. The Rockefellers' involvement with the World Trade Center site ended decades before the rebuilding, their influence having waned as the family's wealth dispersed across generations and as the institutions they had controlled became more independent. David Rockefeller died in 2017 at the age of 101, having outlived the buildings he had worked to create. Having seen his vision of Lower Manhattan as the unquestioned center of global finance only partially realized, the towers destroyed and replaced with structures that served similar functions but that lacked the absolute confidence of the originals. His legacy was complicated. Defender of free market capitalism while exercising power through networks that operated outside market mechanisms, advocate for urban renewal while remaining insulated from its costs. Philanthropist whose charitable giving was enabled by wealth extracted from labor and resources through systems that concentrated returns to capital while distributing risks and costs to workers and communities. The story of the Twin Towers is not primarily a story about buildings. It is a story about power, about who decides how cities develop and whose interests those decisions serve, about the displacement of communities and the erasure of history, about the gap between the rhetoric of public purpose and the reality of private benefit, about structures that appear permanent until they are not, about the human costs of decisions made by people who do not bear those costs themselves. The towers were built because the Rockefellers and the Port Authority and various business interests wanted them built and had the power to override objections and to reshape Lower Manhattan according to their preferences. The towers were destroyed by people who saw them as symbols of systems they opposed and who were willing to kill thousands of people to strike at those symbols. The towers were rebuilt because authorities decided that not rebuilding would concede victory to those who destroyed them, and because the site represented valuable real estate and symbolic capital that various interests wanted to control. The workers who built the original towers and who maintained them and who died in them and who cleaned up the ruins and who built the replacement structures are largely absent from the official narratives. Remembered collectively but not individually, acknowledged as necessary but not valued as significant. The small business owners displaced from Radio Row are forgotten entirely, their neighborhood erased, and their livelihoods destroyed in service of a vision of progress that had no place for what they represented. The residents of Lower Manhattan who breathed toxic dust and who developed cancers and respiratory diseases years later are compensated through programs that required extended advocacy and that acknowledge harm without admitting responsibility. These absences and erasures and delayed recognitions are not incidental to the story, but central to it. Evidence of whose experiences matter in official histories and whose are treated as expendable background to stories about power and architecture and ambition. The Twin Towers stood as monuments to a particular moment in American capitalism, when large institutions seemed capable of planning and executing projects at scales that dwarfed previous human achievement, when technological confidence had not yet been tempered by the disasters that would reveal the limits of engineering and management, when the assumption that growth would continue indefinitely made speculation seem like prudence. The building's destruction revealed that the security they seemed to offer was illusory, that structures designed to project power were vulnerable in ways their creators had not imagined. That concentration created risks as well as efficiencies. The rebuilding has reproduced many of the patterns that shaped the original construction, with public resources deployed to serve private interests, with decisions made through processes that limit democratic participation, with memorialization that encourages individual mourning rather than structural analysis. The bedrock of Manhattan remains, deeper than the foundations, older than the city, indifferent to what is built upon it and what is destroyed and what is built again. The schist and granite will outlast every structure, will remain when the current towers have been demolished or have collapsed, will provide foundation for whatever comes next, bearing the weight of human ambition without judgment or memory, stone formed before history and enduring beyond it, the only permanent thing in a landscape of impermanent monuments.